Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. For this episode of Horns, we are joining you from the Summer Seminar on History and Statecraft, sponsored by the Clements Center at the University of Texas Austin and held in the beautiful environs of Beaver Creek, Colorado. This morning, we retreated to discussions of the role of NATO expansion, as well as promises that may or may not have been made to the Soviet Union and then Russia at the time, with a fascinating discussion with Professor Jim Goldgeier of American University and Brookings Institute, as well as a fascinating discussion of Brexit and its implications from Ambassador Alex Hall. So, as was pointed out by Will Imboden, the Executive Director of the Clements Center, these two events really are kind of parentheses, 25 years apart. One dealing with questions of expanding the European identity and community, particularly as related to security, and the other dealing with the question of making it smaller and removing oneself from it. And so in our discussion this evening, we'd like to examine some of those implications and issues and what issues may have remained the same and yet driven very different perspectives. And before we get into this, I'll ask our esteemed guests to introduce themselves. Ambassador, will you start?
Yes, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here. So I am Alex Hall. I am a former British diplomat of 30 plus years experience. And my most recent assignment was as the Brexit spokesperson in Washington, DC. I followed the twists and turns of Brexit very closely, and my job was to explain what was going on to US audiences and also the opportunities for UK-US collaboration post-Brexit. For those of you who followed the twists and turns of Brexit politics, you will understand this was not an easy job. And in December 2019, I actually resigned from the British Foreign Office, not because I opposed Brexit, but because I felt it was being pursued in a dishonest way. And I could not, in all good conscience, continue my career consistent with the Civil Service Code of Integrity. And so I resigned. And I am now at home. Thank you.
Professor Goldgeier.
Great. Yes, I'm Jim Goldgeier. It's just great to be back in Beaver Creek and be here with the Clements Center program on state history and statecraft. And I'm a professor at American University. I've been at AU for about 10 years now. And I'm also a senior visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I sit in the Center on the United States and Europe. And we have an incredible group of American and European scholars working in that center. I first started writing about NATO enlargement about 25 years ago and never anticipated that interest in that subject would remain this strong for this long and that it would still get people all riled up, but it does.
So I think while those in the audience here have had the benefit of hearing your fascinating presentations this morning, and our listeners will have the opportunity, I hope, to listen to them as separate Horns episodes at a date in the future, it's probably helpful to set the stage if I could ask each of you to just briefly describe the circumstances first of the debate surrounding NATO enlargement, and then, Ambassador, about the circumstances and the implications of Brexit. So, Jim, why don't you start us off?
Well, the biggest issue in the debate over NATO enlargement has been the issue of the relationship with Russia. Opponents of NATO expansion will argue that, in a sense, this was the original sin, that the decision to move forward with NATO's expansion into Central and Eastern Europe betrayed the Russians, violated promises that were made to the Russians, and were the cause of the downturn in U.S.-Russia relations that continue to this day. Proponents of NATO enlargement tend to argue that there were no promises made about enlargement, that NATO stuck to its assurances that it wouldn't do anything in a way that undermined Soviet and later Russian security, that NATO's a defensive alliance, that Russians should not feel that this is directed against them, and that really that Vladimir Putin has used this issue and others to shore up his political position at home. There are a couple other issues that tend to get raised as well. Certainly proponents are eager to point to the positive impact on Central and Eastern Europe and the stability that NATO enlargement has provided. And there are I think, differences on each side of the debate with respect to the impact on NATO as an institution. Opponents of NATO's expansion tend to argue that it overextended NATO, that it took NATO into areas where it has to defend countries that are very difficult to defend, providing security guarantees for them in the face of possible Russian aggression. Whereas for those who are proponents of enlargement, they argue that it has prevented further Russian aggression beyond Ukraine, and that the costs of defending that territory, especially Estonia, is manageable for the alliance.
Excellent. And Alex, could you give us a quick summary of Brexit? I won't ask you to repeat your tour de force from earlier, but just sort of the highlights.
It's a little hard to summarize 5 years in 2 minutes, but you summarized 20 years or 30 years in 2 minutes. So I would say that Brexit was motivated both by historical reasons, the UK always having had a somewhat different experience of membership of the EU, and more proximate reasons such as a backlash against the large waves of immigration we saw, especially after the Syria crisis, a backlash against globalization, the impact of the financial crisis of 2008, and a sense that the institutions that were governing our lives were remote, and that there was a sense of loss of control. So I think the Leave campaign had by far the better argument of a slogan of taking back control and offering something new, whereas the Remain side of the House was really offering more of the status quo, and it was clear that people felt uncomfortable with the status quo, or a majority of people felt uncomfortable with the status quo. The real problem that I think Brexit has presented for the UK is that while there was a vote to leave the EU, there was never any definition about what kind of Brexit we were voting for. And that is why for the next 3 years after the vote to leave the EU, the UK became roiled in a series of very agonizing political debates that played out in Parliament over what kind of Brexit we were trying to achieve. And complicating that was the fact that there wasn't a neat split between Brexiteers on one side and Remainers on the other side. The Brexiteers were internally divided about what kind of Brexit they wanted. And the splits cut across party lines as well. So it became incredibly hard to reach a consensus on what kind of Brexit we wanted. And Theresa May tried to bridge the differences with a cabinet composed of Brexiteers and Remainers. But in the end, what she was offering was a kind of Goldilocks solution that was too hard for some and too soft for others. And overshadowing all of this is the fact that unlike any other country in the EU, for the UK, the decision to leave was complicated by the historical circumstances around Ireland and the peace process in Ireland. And once the UK had taken the decision to leave the UK, the impact of that on the peace process in Ireland became one of the most difficult issues in the debate. So while Theresa May did try to negotiate a slightly softer form of Brexit that mitigated some of the economic impact, at the end of the day, that was not enough for the hard Brexiteers. And there wasn't really a logic to voting to leave the EU if your concern was ultimately political about taking back control. And politically, the only logical form of Brexit is the one we got, which was a very hard form of Brexit, where we were genuinely leaving the EU and leaving all the political institutions. So politically, I think the form of Brexit we've got is a relatively coherent one. However, I think from a pragmatic and an economic point of view, the consequences of that are going to play out increasingly, and we're already beginning to see that there is some cost to it. Looking to the future, I think the question is, once the negative impacts and consequences of Brexit become clear, will there be a backlash in the British public against Brexit and a desire to reconnect with the EU and rebuild some of that cooperation? Or will there be a sense in the UK, which we're currently seeing, of just blaming the EU? It's their fault that this Brexit isn't working, and we just didn't get the right form of Brexit, and it's all the EU's fault. And I think that will be a very interesting debate.
Excellent. So I appreciate you guys setting the table in this way. And I think it really sets up nicely, in part because some listeners may be a little bit perplexed because we have two very different events. We have one event involving the future role of the modern world's most established and successful multilateral security alliance. And we have another involving the future of an economic and social union that is really only just now starting to come into its own. And these may seem at first glance like very different things, but I think one of the themes that came up in the Q&A this afternoon that really ties this together is the question of identity and the question of how people and states define their identity, whether nationally, supranationally, through collective organizations, and how that identity then influences their perception, both of their interests, but also of their threats. And I'm wondering if you guys could talk about that, because it seems like this is a thread that really became apparent in this NATO debate, and yet is increasingly drawing out in international affairs today.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the NATO debate, it's interesting when we look at the Central and Eastern Europeans and then when we look at the Russians. For the Central and Eastern Europeans, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the communist regimes, I mean, this gives them finally the opportunity to be part of that West that they had looked at, from the other side of the Iron Curtain throughout the entire Cold War. And so it's just an enormous moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the collapse of the Soviet Union for them to reach out to the West, for the West to reach out to them, for the West to basically say, look, if you can undertake these steps of political and economic reform, if you can become democracies, market economies, if you can assure us protection of human rights, that you're not going to, seek to change borders, you can be part of this successful West and, these two major institutions, NATO and the European Union. And in fact, just even the way we talk about the geography during the Cold War, we talked about Western Europe and we talked about Eastern Europe. When that Cold War ended, countries like Poland, Hungary, then Czechoslovakia, what became the Czech Republic and Slovakia, I mean, they wanted to be talked about as Central Europe. They didn't want to be relegated to the other side of Europe. And so I think, even just the way we talk about the geography has changed since the end of the Cold War. And then there's Russia. Is Russia part of Europe or not? Russia today is not part of these major European institutions. And I think, there are lots of questions to be raised about Russia's relationship with the rest of Europe, with the West, and the evolution of its views over time. Boris Yeltsin, as president of Russia, clearly wanted Russia to become part of the West. But he also wanted Russia to be treated as an equal, which was going to be rather difficult given the state of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he wasn't going to be able to set the terms for how Europe evolved. And decisions were made by the United States and the Europeans that Russians viewed as counter to their interest. I think when Putin became president, he looked at the turmoil of the 90s, saw the Yeltsin years as humiliating, believed that his job was to rebuild the Russian state, was to rebuild Russia as a great power, and a great power that could relate to the West as an independent country. Didn't have to be part of the West. It could have good relations with the West potentially, but it needed to be treated as a separate great power that was not part of that Western institutional structure. And I think that's a big difference as we go from Yeltsin to Putin.
Alex, how much of a role did identity play in the whole Brexit debate? And which identity?
Thank you. I think identity was very central to the Brexit debate, and not in quite as linear a fashion as some people might suppose. It would be a caricature to say that those who voted to leave the EU were more concerned about a sort of Little England retreating from the world kind of psychology, while all those who favoured Remain were the globalists. On both the Remain and the Leave side, there were split analyses and reasons for their vote. On the Brexiteer side, I would argue there was a kind of fearful, more isolationist, anti-immigration, we want to go back to the way we were kind of psychology driving it. But there was also an outward-looking Brexiteer narrative. We want to be global Britain. We don't want everything to be done through the prism of the EU. We would like to engage with the rest of the world. The balance is shifting towards the Indo-Pacific. The EU is economically less liberal and free market oriented than we would like to be. So there were two narratives on the Brexiteer side, and there were also two narratives on the Remainer side. I think you had some people who voted Remain because they were fearful of change. It was sort of comfortable being in the EU. The UK can't go it alone. We're a middle power. We need to accept that, which is a sort of slightly fearful reason for wanting to stay in the EU. And then there were those like Tony Blair who would say, no, being in the EU has been a force multiplier for us. It's an added asset. We can be all these things and more. So there were identity issues on both the Brexiteer and the Remainer side. I think the biggest tragedy that's happened since that vote is there was a period where a smart Prime Minister could have tried to bring some of these themes together and forge a consensus about what kind of Brexit we wanted. But Theresa May actually drove a wedge between the Remainers and the Leavers. One of her early speeches was to talk about people who were citizens of somewhere, i.e. people who felt a British identity, and citizens of nowhere who just sort of turned their back on the UK and were just internationalists. And she meant it in a pejorative way. And that trend has continued over the last few years, where those who voted Remain are now derided and castigated by the most ardent Brexiteers as actually enemies of the people. And when Remainers have questioned the form of Brexit, that's been, the establishment, a supposed elite, sort of thwarting the will of the people and sort of betraying the Brexit cause. And the referendum was only 52% to 48%. There was never an explicit mandate for a hard Brexit. But now, as a result of the way the Brexit's been implemented, I would argue there are a large number of people in the UK who feel very politically homeless. They were drowned out in the subsequent debate on Brexit. And then there's one other key identity issue which has been thrown to the fore by Brexit, and this is really a very dangerous moment, which is Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to stay in the EU. The Welsh did vote to leave, but the kind of Brexit that has been delivered has been seen very much as an English form of Brexit. The Scots do not feel their interests were taken into account. A lot of the Irish population do not feel their interests were taken into account. Even now, as there are problems over implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol, an Irish politician was telling David Frost, the UK negotiator last week, don't forget, actually a majority of us wanted to stay in the EU and we like the protocol. We want that to stay and we want it to be implemented. And so one consequence of Brexit is there is now a renewed debate about the balance between England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And that's a very difficult issue.
So you mentioned this denigration of Remainers as being part of the establishment and an assumption that the establishment is working against the interests of the people. And it strikes me that one of the interesting contrasts between these two scenarios is a very different view of institutions. At the time of the NATO debate, even in the face of the abject failure of the institutions they had known for their entire lives, the states of formerly Eastern Europe evinced extraordinary trust in NATO as an institution, as did, in fact, Russia by virtue of its negative response to the anticipated results. And yet now, 25 years after that, in the face of prosperity and security in the interim, trust in the institutions, both supranational and national, seems to have degraded. And I'm curious as to your thoughts as to why and what impact that level of trust had on the outcome of those situations.
Well, it's interesting in the NATO case, and right, as you say, and it's true at the very beginning, in 1990, as things are coming apart in the East and the Warsaw Pact is collapsing, I mean, it wasn't really a natural move right away for these countries to think, oh, we've just spent all these decades in the Warsaw Pact, and now we're going to jump into NATO. The initial response in many of these countries was, okay, we're glad to be out of the Warsaw Pact, and we just want to be neutral, and for everybody to just leave us alone. And there was some interest in, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe that had been established in 1975 with the Helsinki Final Act, that what becomes the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The idea that, well, maybe, we can sort of use that institution to help build this broader Europe. But I think that what happens is the countries become very concerned about what might happen in Russia. I think they watched what was happening in Yugoslavia with the civil war that breaks out in Yugoslavia, and concerns about a similar kind of scenario breaking out in the former Soviet Union. People forget that there was all this talk about, well, what happens if the former Soviet Union is a Yugoslavia with nuclear weapons, and sort of in a sense of, well, given our history. Also, fears of what German unification would mean throughout the region. Just all that uncertainty. I think countries thought, being part of NATO and having that protection would be beneficial to their future. And they also start to look at what being a member of the EU will mean, although it's very clear that what they have to do to join the EU is going to take a tremendously long period of time, given the need to fulfill all the rules and regulations of the European Union. And I think for the countries, those countries that have joined NATO, I think they still feel very strongly that the institution has provided the kind of security that they otherwise wouldn't have. I mean, certainly for the Baltic countries, they would be incredibly fearful of Russian aggression if they weren't included. Even Poland, feels much more confident and comfortable. The real issue has become, given what was required of these countries to get in and the commitments to democracy and the rule of law and the other issues associated with that, respect for human rights, how is it now that countries that did come in the first round in 1999, Poland and Hungary, two of the countries that came in 1999, how is it that they are backsliding on democracy and have moved in a more authoritarian direction? And I think that's raising a lot of questions, and it's raising questions for the European Union. NATO doesn't have a lot of leverage in this instance, but the question is the relationship of countries like Poland and Hungary within the European Union and the kind of fissures that are resulting.
Well, it's also interesting because it signaled a different institutional role for NATO. Certainly, the concern with questions of democratic governance and human rights was not a hallmark of security policy at the height of the Cold War. It became something that was incorporated as NATO started questioning whether they should expand their geographic and subject matter remit. But I'm curious about the institutional questions in Brexit, Alex.
Thank you. So I think it's true that distrust of the EU was a large factor behind the Brexit vote. There was a sense that the EU was remote, that decisions were taken in Brussels. People didn't know who their member of the European Parliament was. The workings of the EU are incredibly complicated to understand, and even experts can get very confused by how the EU works. It's an incredibly complicated beast. But the other reason is there was never any real political force in UK politics, except perhaps Tony Blair, the brief few years when he was in power. There was never really a political wing in the UK that was really actively making the positive case for the UK relationship with the EU. Once we were inside the EU and after the single market, the UK's relationship with the EU became one of successive summits where British prime ministers were supposed to go there and bang their handbags on the table and say, I want my money back, or I don't want to join the euro, or I don't want to join Schengen, or I don't want to join this or that. And so that kind of rather negative narrative sort of became totally the prism through which the UK population heard about the EU. It was the EU always wanting to do things and impose things on us that it was the job of British prime ministers to resist. So it's hardly surprising that there wasn't a huge sort of pro-EU constituency who was actively making the case to stay in the EU in a positive sense. But that distrust of institutions didn't extend to every institution. I'm not aware that there's ever really been any wavering in UK support for NATO, for example. The role of NATO is clear, and the UK's role in it is something we're proud of. So it wasn't a backlash against all institutions. It was particularly related to the EU. I'd quite like to extrapolate a little bit on the trust issue, however, because Brexit has certainly not lanced the boil of distrust in the UK. In fact, I would argue that since Brexit, trust in institutions has gone down even further. And that's for several reasons. One is, as I said earlier, this constant attack on those who favoured Remain as enemies of the people. That's been a very divisive rhetoric. There was a distrust of the establishment and advisors and experts on EU because it was assumed that more of them wanted to stay in the EU. Any advice they gave was suspect. So there's been a sort of institutional breakdown of trust. And when the Supreme Court ruled that Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament was illegal, that led Boris Johnson and his party to accuse the judges of being traitors of the people. So there's been an erosion of trust in institutions. There's also been an erosion of trust within the United Kingdom because of the lack of consensus over the kind of Brexit that we should implement. And as I said earlier, with Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales. But unfortunately, I would also argue there's now been an international perception of distrust about the UK because the UK always stood for the rule of law. And I think one of the most damaging developments that's happened over Brexit is when our government threatened unilaterally to breach certain aspects of the withdrawal of the Northern Ireland Protocol. That has been hugely damaging. And it's been picked up and it's been noticed. And I think there is an element of distrust between the UK and the EU and an element of perception around the rest of the world that the UK is not quite the exemplar we have always portrayed ourselves to be.
So speaking of trust in states, Jim, I know you mentioned that Josh Shifrinson and Mark Trachtenberg and others have traced at least some portion of the Russian distrust of U.S. and NATO leaders, as well as U.S. and NATO actions, to the circumstances surrounding this debate. And so I guess my question is, in your view, is this a fair assessment? And is this really sort of the OG distrust among states that laid the way for Brexit and the subsequent things that happened later?
Well, so on NATO enlargement, and you're right. I mean, especially Josh Shifrinson has done some amazing archival work trying to look at the issue of what kind of assurances were given to the Soviets in 1990 during the period in which there were the negotiations over German unification, and then just beyond, sort of what was being said to the Soviets and then the Russians. And Mark Trachtenberg has a recent piece in International Security on this issue, because a lot of the debate has been about, well, whatever was said, it wasn't written down, and so it doesn't count by those people who tend to dismiss the issue. Those people who think it's a hugely important issue, argue that countries make assurances all the time that aren't written down, and that those should be taken seriously from one administration to the next. There's also discussion, of course, about the fact that the Russians who are complaining that there were assurances made that were broken, even if they weren't written down, also tend not to mention the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, the agreement among the US, UK, Ukraine, and Russia to guarantee that they would respect the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Ukraine, which, of course, Russia violated in 2014 with its invasion and its annexation of Crimea. I tend to tend to split out the issue of assurances into two separate areas. So one is the question of what was said specifically about NATO enlargement. And, there's a lot of discussion about the comments that were made in February of 1990. For example, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, German foreign minister, and Gorbachev, James Baker, U.S. Secretary of State, and Soviet leader Gorbachev, in which, the issue of NATO's so-called jurisdiction not extending 1 inch to the east was discussed and seemingly agreed to. And I think, on that specific issue, there's just a lot of problems with our understanding of it. And I would just mention two. One is just, the negotiations are getting underway. There's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, both sides were sort of unsure about the kinds of things that were going to be important to them. Certainly from the U.S. side, the positions weren't firmly formulated yet. And they're really sort of trying to figure out, what do the Soviets need so that we can actually get Germany unified, and they will go along with it. And at the end of the day, what Gorbachev most wanted in those negotiations was cash. He wanted assistance from the West, especially the West Germans, that he needed for implementation of his domestic program, and he got it. So I feel like during the negotiations on German unification, he was looking for cash. He got the cash, and sort of that's the way I think about it. The other issue is that, sort of the idea that the U.S. and Soviets were going to determine the futures of what Poland, Hungary, Czech, others could pursue without them in the room, smacks of earlier eras, and I don't, think are appropriate for our era. But for me, the issue has always been a more general set of assurances, which I do believe were given by the West to the Soviets and then the Russians, that the West would not take advantage of their withdrawal from Europe to undermine their security. And I think here we have two positions that I think are very difficult to bridge. From the Western side, it's, we lived up to that. Americans withdrew massive numbers of troops from Europe, agreed to severe limits on heavy weaponry through the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, evolved NATO to be a more political institution, developed a relationship with Russia, created a permanent joint council with Russia, and viewing NATO as a defensive institution, have tried to make the case that it didn't set about to violate those assurances and didn't set out to undermine Russian security. The Russians looked at NATO taking in all the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, and also 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and said, you guys totally undermined our security. You took this Cold War institution and you moved it closer. And of course you violated those assurances. And I think we should, pay attention to both of those perspectives. The Russian one is a little tricky because they went back and forth a lot on how they viewed this. And I think that really up until the declaration in April of 2008, when NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, I think the Russians largely felt like, most in the Russian elite felt that this wasn't hugely damaging to Russian security. But then you have the declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And I think for the Russians that did cross a line.
So that raises an interesting question, because really, since 1989, up until, I suppose, the actual full implementation of Brexit about 6 months ago, both NATO and the EU were growth industries. As you mentioned, Jim, they incorporated all the former Warsaw Pact countries as well as several of the former Soviet republics. But at the same time, the EU also welcomed many of these states into their membership. And there seems to have been a relationship that, while not explicitly articulated, was widely recognized between membership in the two organizations. And as the EU grew larger, it grew more powerful. And as it grew more powerful, Britain began to resent the restrictions that they perceived from their membership. And so I guess I'm wondering, without being too deterministic about it, is there a path that can be traced from NATO expansion to Brexit?
That's a really fascinating question, and one that scholars should look into in a little bit, more thoroughly. I think there's possibly a connection. But the irony is that Britain was a huge champion of enlargement. We were hugely in favour of it. And actually, I would like to think we had a really excellent relationship with the new countries that came into the EU. And arguably, a lot of those countries had a more liberal economic perspective, a more rigorous commitment to NATO, and a strong relationship with the US and a transatlanticism that we very much favoured. And so from a strategic point of view, enlargement was not just about spreading peace and stability and economic prosperity in Europe, on the continent of Europe, but arguably it was playing to our strategic perspectives as well. Another way in which enlargement was potentially a good thing, if you were sceptical about a too powerful EU institution, is there was certainly a hope that as the EU enlarged, the sheer practicality of trying to coordinate on every issue would actually mute the desire for more integration. We would become bigger and looser, and therefore we would collaborate in areas where there was an obvious, net benefit, but that we would stop this drive for ever closer union, because that was clearly an impossible concept when the EU was so big. But it didn't stop that ratchet effect and that desire for ever closer union. If anything, it just heightened those tensions between some of the core founding members of the EU, who actually were frustrated that as the EU got bigger, it became more unwieldy and even harder to get that integration, and those who favoured a slightly more looser arrangement. And in order to make this unwieldy beast work, it did require more majority voting in increased areas. And it also required the UK to pay a little bit more proportionately into the EU, because relative to the newer members, the UK was obviously one of the wealthier members. So the perceived cost of the EU was enhanced, even though we were also widening our market and enhancing our stability. But I think the biggest single factor where you could make a case that EU enlargement has some link to Brexit is the freedom of movement one. And the UK actually was one of the most generous countries when the new countries joined the EU in immediately extending freedom of movement to the newer members of the EU. And I think that led a lot of citizens from those countries looking for economic prospects to come to the UK. And actually, also the UK was a growing, thriving place then, so there were more job opportunities. And also, we spoke English, and that was also an easier docking point for a lot of people. So we had a huge influx of people from the new countries, and that did lead to some tensions. And there is some evidence that on the Brexiteer leave and Remain debate, the Remainers were sort of derided as being, elite Londonites who were sort of happy to benefit from this cheap nannies and Labour and Polish plumbers and didn't really suffer the consequences, whereas the ordinary, decent working people were being undercut by this influx of workers. So I think there may have been some connection, even though I personally feel that enlargement from a strategic point of view was a British gain.
Jim, any thoughts on that?
On whether NATO enlargement is connected to Brexit?
Yeah, if we'd given Russia their way, could we have spared Britain the pain?
I don't.
It's a stretch.
Yeah, I think, Doyle, I think it's a really interesting connection. I agree with Alex. We're thinking of, what's worth thinking about is the way in which these institutions have changed over time, and whether or not then that had an impact on the way countries looked at them. The other issue that we haven't mentioned, but was sort of alluded to by Alex's point about sort of, less power within the European Union, was the way in which enlargement of the European Union changed the ability of France and Germany to sort of be these, two drivers that, everybody else had to follow. I mean, the more that you added these other countries, the less those two sort of seemed to have the kind of power they did in the earlier years of the European Union. I think that was given, especially the German interest in enlargement, I think, that became very frustrating for them.
So in the couple of minutes that we have remaining, since we are at a conference on history and statecraft, I'm curious as to your thoughts of the role that history played, particularly in the Russian case, as well as in the Brexiteers case, and not necessarily the sort of rigorous academic history that the people gathered here practice, so much as the kind of constructed common mythology that helps to inform identity and that people call on as part of populist movements and things like that.
Well, I think there are two really interesting ways in which history comes into play when we think about what happened with NATO after the Cold War. And one is just, within the George H.W. Bush administration, as you have the collapsing of the communist regimes, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and lots of talk about, well, okay, the Warsaw Pact has disappeared, so we don't need NATO anymore. Just this horror of, wait a minute, we can't get rid of NATO. NATO is the vehicle by which the United States has this role in European security. Without NATO, the United States doesn't have a way of shaping it. And also, for George H.W. Bush and those around him, really took what they saw as the lessons of the 20th century. They looked at the 20th century and, to just boil it down, it's post-1919 bad, post-1945 good. That, if the United States leaves Europe, problems ensue. And that what you had after 1945 was a United States that helped ensure the prosperity and freedom and security of Western Europe, and that what you had now was an opportunity. What in the Clinton years, a lot of talk about, we can now do for Europe's East what we did for Europe's West. This idea that there was now this opportunity that history had denied during the Cold War, right? I mean, those countries are on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Okay, curtain's down. Now we can bring them into this wider Europe. But then there's also the question of Russia. And I think a lot of the debate over NATO enlargement is between those who think there was really finally an opportunity to bring Russia into the West, to bring Russia closer to the West, that, Russia didn't have to stand outside of Europe. And so opponents of enlargement tend to look at what happened and say, it fed Russian paranoia, it undermined Russian security, and so they reacted against that. Whereas others, who tend to favor enlargement, I think tended not to have hugely high hopes about what was possible with Russia, that Russia, did define its interests very, very differently, and that Russia wasn't going to really be able to integrate into Europe the way some people discussed. And so, I think for a lot of proponents of enlargement, the relationship with Russia, people feel that the relationship with Russia wouldn't be that different in the absence of enlargement. And it is worth noting there are lots of other issues that have ticked off the Russians over the years. And, if you look, for example, at the conversations between Clinton and Yeltsin, the memorandum of conversation, I think it's like 55 phone calls and 17 in-person meetings that are declassified on the Clinton Library website. The discussions over the Kosovo War are much more severe and much more negative than any conversation they ever had about NATO enlargement.
Alex?
Thank you. I think history has been a hugely influential part of what's going on in the UK since the Brexit referendum. As I said in my remarks earlier today, I think our historical relationship with the EU and the fact that it was different from the experience of the founding members influenced the Brexit debate. The UK was not a founding member, and while Winston Churchill thought the concept of a European coal and steel community was very good for the continent, he didn't see it as something that was necessary for the UK. So the whole historical experience of the 20th century influenced our perspective on the value of the EU. And our motive for joining the EU was always more economic than political. So we had that sort of historically different experience that coloured the prism through which we viewed the EU. I would also argue that the UK always had a very global perspective and had always enjoyed this sense of having connections around the world. And there was a sense in some quarters that our membership of the EU, I don't necessarily buy this argument, but that it did sort of limit what we could do because everything always had to be agreed with the EU first, and that we maybe had a little bit more flexibility and freedom outside the EU, particularly on foreign policy. And actually, if there's one aspect of Brexit where I think there has been some genuine, refreshing new development, it is in a review of our foreign policy and defence and the recent integrated review, suggesting some genuinely fresh thinking. But I do think Brexit was also motivated by a kind of nostalgia for a sort of a golden era that actually doesn't really exist anymore. It is no surprise to me that Boris Johnson has continued to try and play on that sense of a golden era by his constant references to Winston Churchill. He wrote a book about Winston Churchill. He would like to be seen as the Winston Churchill of his time. Though in that famous presidential debate, you are no Jack Kennedy, and he is no Winston Churchill, in my view. But he would like to be seen in that role. And during his handling of the COVID pandemic, the references to the spirit of the Blitz and coming together, it's really been extraordinary. And to my mind, a bit hackneyed. And one of the aspects of Brexit that I think is quite sad is, so Boris Johnson and his government have tried to sort of play on that sort of patriotism and those sort of cultural cards. And they have had some resonance, but they also have had limits. The UK actually isn't a deeply xenophobic, racist country, as it turns out. And there was a massive backlash against its government when it tried to play the racist card around the recent soccer Euros and did not condoned fans booing the taking of the knee. Britain actually is a multicultural society, and opinion polls suggest that once the Brexit vote happened, concern over immigration has completely dissipated. And for the younger generation, they are more multicultural. They were used to having a European identity as well as a British identity. And the biggest sadness of Brexit is it is cutting off opportunities for them. And that divide between the sort of older and younger sectors in the UK, it is the younger part of our country that is going to suffer the consequences of Brexit the hardest.
Thank you. We've been discussing the interrelationships and the common themes and the connections between the expansion of European identity with the admission of new NATO members starting in 1989-90 and the diminution of European identity with a European member leaving the European Union with Brexit earlier this year. We've been speaking with Ambassador Alex Hall and Professor Jim Goldgeier. Alex, Jim, thank you so much for continuing the earlier conversations. Really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.